Welcome back to the Byzantine Catholic Seminary's online course, The Plainchant of the Byzantine Catholic Church. In this final lecture, we will consider various aspects of the practical use of Prostopinije in the parish. With what we've covered in this course, let's look once more at the quote from Orthodox musicologist Ivan Gardner that we saw earlier. In Carpatho-Russia, in all village churches, both Uniate and Orthodox, congregational singing of all the services in their entirety has been practiced exclusively, including the hymns of the proper, utilizing the full range of tones and melodies. The people chant from the Veliki Sbornik, which contains all the necessary texts. The cantors, the more experienced chanters among the parishioners, who stood on the kliros, began the chanting. As soon as those present recognized the melody, the whole church sang. They sang all the stikira, all the traparia, all the irmoi. In a word, everything that the typicon indicated was to be sung. They sang in unison, and whoever was able added a parallel melody line or improvised a bass line. The impression produced was one of extraordinary power. But the main thing was that those present were not passive listeners. They were not the public, but were aware that they themselves assisted at the performance of the divine services. Who leads the singing? Well, at least potentially, any member of the congregation can serve as cantor. Gardner simply comments that the cantors are, quote, the more experienced chanters among the parishioners. The role of the cantor assumes someone who would know the chant melodies and can lead the congregation in singing them. This in turn requires some knowledge of the services, a basic ability to sing, and enough confidence to start off singing each hymn in the service. For commonly sung services, especially when the number of the faithful is small, it's not uncommon for any experienced parishioner in the parish to serve as cantor. To prevent confusion and maintain order in church, however, it is still important that someone be identifiable as the person who leads the singing. At one time, all church singers, except those in women's monasteries, were taken from among the clergy, meaning that almost all church singing in those days was done by men. In parishes, however, women have always taken a large part in singing, and today serve as cantors also. Some of our churches have full-time cantors who lead the singing at every church service. The professionalism of church teaching, however, means that very few cantors still serve as teachers in schools connected to the church as well. And even if they did, the cantor's attendance at funerals, for example, would cause significant disruption in classroom schedules. Other churches have several cantors, with some process of providing for the presence of a cantor at each service. Some cantors have to take time away from work to attend weekday services or lead the singing at funerals. Thus, the time commitment can be considerable. This is one reason that older cantors, retired from the workforce, are often at the cantor stand. In the Byzantine rite, there is a formal service of the making or ordination of a cantor and reader. A wider use of the service in our day may require the Church's decision on whether to ordain both men and women as cantors. One possible solution is to formally recognize that in our churches the cantor exercises a lay rather than a clerical ministry. Where does the cantor stand? Well, Gardner describes cantors as singing on the kliros. The kliros is a lectern or cantor stand which holds books and other materials necessary to lead the church singing. The illustration here shows a cantor stand that can hold materials on each side and be turned as needed. Exact observance of the typicon requires two klirosi, one on the right and one on the left, to allow for antiphonal singing led by a cantor on each side of the church. The kliros on the right-hand side, as seen facing the iconostas, is considered the main or first kliros, and if there is only one kliros, it should be on the right. Many churches make do with one cantor stand, and some have none at all in the front of the church. In this case, the choir loft over the west end of the church, that is opposite the sanctuary, has become the place for the cantor. This has the advantage that the sound of singing comes from the same place in the church, whether it is done by a cantor or choir, but it can leave the congregation standing in between two singing voices, the cantor, and the priest. Some parishes are used to being led from behind in this manner, while others benefit from a cantor singing down in the church. One real advantage of a choir loft for chanting is that the cantor is not seen directly by the people, and this can be especially useful if the cantor is involved in a flurry of activity, pulling out music, negotiating with assistant cantors over who is to sing what, and so on. This is probably why monastic clerosi are often surrounded by a screen to allow the singing to be heard, while the cantors remain unseen. On the other hand, either a cantor in the choir loft or behind a screen, it cannot be seen by the faithful and thus cannot cue them in some ways which are sometimes appropriate. Pews, of course, have become common in our churches and place restrictions on possible locations for cantor stands. In parishes where pews run right up to the aisle before the iconostas and solea, the installation of a cantor stand may require the removal of some pews. For this reason, a number of parishes have chosen to place the cantor stand toward the back of the church on the ground floor, replacing some of the pews there. Of course, much also depends on the acoustics of the church, and these acoustics will be somewhat different when the church is empty as opposed to when it is full. Churches with wooden or stone interior have a very different sound from churches that make use of carpeting. In our tradition, the best solution is probably to have a reasonably attractive and well-made cantor stand or kleros to the right of the iconostas, with storage space for the necessary materials for each service, and for cantors to become used to conducting their work without a great deal of visual distraction to the faithful. A parish can make do with one cantor for all services, but having more than one cantor or several assistant cantors makes things much easier. It supports antiphonal singing and allows for the education of new cantors over time. Antiphonal singing is the alternation of singing or chanting between two groups in the church, whether clergy and people, left and right sides of the church, or men and women. Antiphonal singing comes down to us from the early Jewish and Syrian singing traditions, and many of the services of the Byzantine tradition were developed with this kind of singing in mind. Many of the prescriptions of the Byzantine liturgical books speak of two choirs, or groups of singers, with some hymns appointed to be sung by the first choir, by the second choir, or by both choirs together. The first choir was the group of singers at the right kleros, the second choir those at the left, as seen from the congregation side of the iconostas. This is why in the Byzantine rite there is almost always an even number of stichira, so that each group of singers has the same amount of material to sing. When stichira are repeated, they are sung first by one choir and then by the other. This monastic or cathedral fashion of singing can easily be adapted to parish use once the division of singers is identified. For example, some priests chant the beginning prayers in alternation with the people. If the congregation is divided into two for antiphonal singing, then each group should have its own leader. For example, there can be one cantor at each side of the church to lead the two sides, or a male cantor and a female cantor to lead men and women singing in alternation. Antiphonal singing provides everyone present with an opportunity to sing and an opportunity to listen, which can be very different experiences even if the same text is being sung in both cases. It also allows for emphasis on particularly important hymns when they are heard being sung by all those present. By starting the singing, the cantor also sets the pitch to be used. Although our Plainchant is notated as if to be sung on particular pitches, in practice the music on the page needs to be transposed by ear to a comfortable pitch for the cantor and congregation to sing. If the priest, deacon, and cantor are used to working with one another, the cantor may very well be able to take the pitch directly from the priest's opening blessing, which can be used to establish a tonal center for the entire service. But it may be necessary to adjust this pitch up or down in the course of the service if it proves to be too high or low. This can be done by the cantor, who starts a new hymn just a little early and on the new pitch. This sort of change is most easily made at the start of a new part of the service, and should be avoided anywhere one hymn immediately is leading into the next. For example, trying to repitch in the middle of a set of stichira, all in the same tone, can be confusing. The cantor also sets the tempo of a part of the service by singing the first few notes before the congregation joins in. If the faithful are very familiar with the piece of music, however, they may begin on their own, and the cantor may have to sing in such a way that the desired tempo is emphasized. But our plain chant normally lacks metronome settings or fixed indications of tempo. Instead, the speed of the singing is determined by the type of the hymn being sung, along with the liturgical setting, the service, the hour, the day, and the season of the liturgical year. In some cases, a hymn is sung to accompany a liturgical action such as a procession, and it is the cantor's responsibility to adapt the chant accordingly, whether by repeating a hymn, perhaps switching from English to Church Slavonic, repeating the refrain, or singing more slowly. It is important, however, never to sing too slowly. Not only is the meaning of the hymn more easily lost, but singers will tend to go flat, requiring the cantor to repitch the singing later in the service. In his Irmologien in 1970, Father Stefan Popp provided some traditional guidance on general tempos. The course of divine services must be neither too fast nor too slow. Generally, this also pertains to the technique of singing. Stichiri, Sedalens, or sessional hymns, and Echtenias, litanies, are sung in a measured but lively manner. Troparia, Kontakia, exaltations, magnifications, canons, hymns of light, and so forth are sung in a measured manner, and hymns and processions, entrances, and so forth are sung in a protracted manner. At a funeral, one is not free to rush, but only the particular moment on the whole of each holy day will sometimes indicate how one may sing. The cantor also sets the dynamics of the singing, that is, the loudness or softness. The chant books provide some guidance in this regard, with marked crescendos and so on. In general, chant is sung at a moderate loudness so that the words can be heard without a great deal of variation within a chant. In some hymns, such changes are marked, but these are often associated with the choir tradition. Singing in an emotional or affected manner has been very much discouraged in the Prostopinije tradition, which highlights the meanings of the words and the prayer of the congregation above the artistry of the cantor. The cantor has a certain amount of freedom to choose which melodies are sung. At Vespers and Matins, in the eight-tone tradition, for example, one might decide whether to use a particular special melody or podoban, or sing a hymn using the ordinary Samhalasan melodies. But the principal choices for music come in the fixed part of the services, especially the Divine Liturgy. Here, hymns such as the Trisagion, or Holy God, and the cherubic hymn come in a wide variety of settings. Of this music, most parishes have a few favorites, and the cantor decides which of these to sing on a particular occasion, or whether to introduce a less well-known setting. The cantor has to take into account what is known to the congregation or singable by them, as well as the liturgical and emotional character of the particular service and the liturgical context. For example, it would be inappropriate to sing the funeral Holy God on a feast day, or a very short cherubic hymn at a divine liturgy with many concelebrating priests, when the procession during the cherubic hymn is likely to take a while. The cantor begins the singing, but it is hardly ever the case that everyone will be singing entirely on the same pitch. At the very least, a congregation containing men, women, and children will likely be singing in octaves rather than in strict unison. That is, each of the faithful can sing the cantor's note, but in his or own singing range. Singing can also be enhanced by harmonization. Some singers on the cantor's pitch, with others singing on different pitches that go well with the base melody, as shown here in an example from the Litany of the Presanctified Gifts. Different cultures have their own singing styles. For example, when singing together, one person may sing one part of a verse and those nearby sing a response or refrain, or everyone may sing together, either repeating the melody on different pitches or singing a different melody at the same time. All these aspects of communal singing occur in the various liturgical chants of the Byzantine Rite. For example, when a hymn is sung in our churches, it is very common for someone to begin singing the same melody, a musical third or above above or below the cantor's melody. Very often, middle voices will sing the same text, moving slightly up or down around the home pitch of the chant, while the lower men's voices, the basses, sing in intervals. This process, sometimes called folk harmonization, has even been recommended for use by small choirs singing chant. For example, the preface to the Sputnik Salomshika, a Russian Orthodox chant collection from the beginning of the 20th century, has this to say: "The basic melody is normally sung with the second part being provided a third above. On certain occasions this is reversed, and the second voice provides an accompaniment a third below. At the same time, however, the lower or bass part picks out a third part by ear, thereby providing the roots of the various chords implied by the two higher voices. If another voice is available, it fills in an appropriate note that is missing or can be doubled. This way of cantorial improvisation resulted in a harmonization of the basic melody called Dyakovskaya singing, or cantorial singing. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the singers in Moscow were particularly fond of such singing, and in many monasteries and parish churches, the melodies of the synodal chant books were sung in this manner during the weekday services. This same technique, which may have first appeared in the cants or canti sung in Ukraine in the 1500s, was regularly employed in the village churches of the Carpathians, where the people harmonized without benefit of any written music. On the link at the bottom of this page, you will find an article written with one cantor's description of how folk harmonization worked in the past. Folk harmonizations, however, violate a number of common rules of Western European classical tradition. That tradition developed rules to avoid an excessively archaic sound associated with older music, mostly church music. The rules and framework of classical music often make use of contrary motion rather than parallel motion, so that every voice or instrumental part stands out in some way. Because of its prestige, beauty, and familiarity, the classical music's rules for harmonization were applied to plainchant as well, especially when it was to be sung by organized choirs, which appeared in the Carpathians in the early 1800s. This kind of singing formed an alternative to folk harmonization. Choir harmonizations, for all their beauty and musical interest, depend on the availability of written sheet music and the ability to read it, rehearsals, and a level of musical organization that is not normally associated with a parish congregation as a whole. The first important church choir in the Greek Catholic Church in the Carpathians was the Harmonia Choir of the Greek Catholic Seminary in Uzhhorod, directed by Konstantin Matajonski, who lived from 1798 to 1858. Matajonski was a Russian revolutionary who arrived in Uzhhorod fleeing from the security forces of the Tsar. He had converted to Catholicism and came to Uzhhorod in 1833. He became the director of a seminary choir the next year and eventually a professor of music at the seminary. This choir regularly sang the solemn divine liturgy at the cathedral in Uzhhorod, using such composers of the Kievan school as Berezovsky, Bortniansky, and Wiedel. Contemporary accounts report that many parishioners at the cathedral who had previously attended only the low or simple Mass, that is, the simple divine liturgy, began attending the solemnly sung divine liturgy and filled the cathedral to capacity. Matajonski and his successors turned the choir into one of the artistic jewels of the region, and it received favorable reviews as far as Budapest. In 1873, choir director Evgeny Talapkovich published a choir setting of the Divine Liturgy in full score based on the Prostopinije Plainchant melodies. This is actually the first known Prostopinije published in modern notation, preceding the Bokshay and Malinich Prostopinije by more than 30 years. Eventually, the seminary in Prešov founded its own choir, as did other churches in the area. Many of these survived as long as the Second World War. In the 1930s and 1940s, once Greek Catholics had become well established in the United States, they began organizing church choirs, which would lead the singing of the faithful using chant-based Prostopinije arrangements, or sing choral arrangements of the Divine Liturgy by Kievan and Russian composers. Since the liturgy was celebrated in Church Slavonic, and the Greek Catholic liturgical texts were fairly close to those used in the Russian Orthodox tradition, the Russian music could be adapted wholesale, with only a small number of changes, and so Russian choral music became familiar in our parishes. In fact, it became so familiar in our parishes that by 1947, Bishop Daniel Ivancho and his presbyteral council were concerned about the potential loss of plain chant responses by the people entirely, and enacted rules according to which the choir in a parish church could only sing twice a month at any particular service. This was ordered specifically because, quote, choir singing in many places is being overemphasized. Choirs generated publicity. They exhibited the splendor of the Greek Catholic liturgy to full advantage, and choral competitions were held. For some years, choir singing accompanied divine liturgies at the annual pilgrimage to Mount St. Macrina. A number of Byzantine Catholic choirs continue to perform today and produce recorded music in both English and Slavonic, using music from a variety of sources. Since its founding, the cantors who participated in the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission have all been experienced choir directors as well. Choir singing can support congregational singing or replace it. Much depends on the choice of music and the attitude of the choir director and choir members, as well as the role of the choir in the services. If chant-based music, using traditional folk harmonizations, or other harmonizations well known to the people, are used, and if the choir director and choir members are welcoming of others singing, then congregational singing may be unaffected or even improved by the presence of a choir. The primary difference between a choir and a group of cantors usually revolves around the choice of music and some regular amount of rehearsal. An unrehearsed choir is usually less helpful in leading congregational singing than a cantor or a small group of cantors would be. A choir can also take on music which is new to the congregation or would otherwise be too difficult for them to sing. This music may then pass into the parishioner's own singing repertoire, or it may be left as a choir piece for special occasions. On the other hand, especially if the parishioners come from a liturgical tradition in which the choir themselves sing all the responses, then choir singing can lead to a diminishing amount of congregational singing. Finally, disagreement over music to be used, or an attempt by parishioners to sing folk harmonizations, while the choir or other parishioners sing choral harmonizations, can lead to a great deal of discord. Because of the way they're written, standard choral harmonizations can clash with folk harmonizations. The reintroduction of the cycle of divine praises in the 1990s, especially Vespers and Matins, led to a need for additional music, much of which was taken from the Prostopinije tradition. But the question would then arise, what music should be used at Vespers and Matins as they're reintroduced into parishes? Some of the music, especially for the fixed parts of the service, is relatively easy to sing. Other music, such as chants for the 8 Samalasan tones, were only known to parishioners in somewhat idiosyncratic form from the Holy Week services. The work of the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission to standardize the Samalasan and other tones, and to provide for their teaching through settings of the Lord's Prayer to each melody, laid a groundwork for wider singing of Vespers and Matins using this music. The Metropolitan Cantor Institute, on the other hand, championed the use of the special melodies or podobni when called for in the liturgical books. On the MCI website, 2 versions of music for each week's Vespers are provided. A simple one, using only the Samalasan melodies, and where the Podoban melodies are appointed, a version of the same music using a mix of Samalasan and Podoban melodies. In general, the restoration of the divine praises has been done in English. While the Slavonic music is available, it would take a fairly skilled cantor to sing the Vespers music from a text to the proper tones, while maintaining correct pronunciation and accent. And even then, much of what was sung would be unintelligible to the majority of the parishioners. Certain music in the Irmologion and even in the Bokshai Prostopinije tradition is no longer used in our churches. For example, a number of the litany response melodies in Bokshay have been replaced by different ones used in the United States. We have also abandoned any use of stichero set to unique melodies for particular feasts, that is, the music in the Irmologian that is only be sung on one day out of the year, and uses melodies different from the standard samalasan or podoban tones. The melodies for the gradual hymns at Matins in the 1906 Prostopinije proved to be difficult to set English texts to, and in this case the Metropolitan Cantor Institute chose to use melodies from the Serbian tradition instead. The melodies for the 8 dogmatica to the Mother of God have very ornate melodies in the Irmologian, which were specifically called out for use in the People's Prayer Book, the Veliki Sbornik. Recall that the dogmatica are the long hymns to the Mother of God, sung at Saturday night in each tone of the week and again on Friday night, which commemorate and explain the mystery of the Incarnation. But these special melodies were not included in the 1906 Bokshay Prostopinije, and as far as I know, they've never been used to set the English texts. An entirely separate category are the spiritual songs or paraliturgical hymns of the Carpathian tradition. These are similar to the canti of the Ukrainian tradition, hymns to God, to the Mother of God, to the saints, as well as hymns for feast days and special occasions, written in poetic lines and set to easy-to-sing melodies. This is an entirely separate tradition of music normally sung outside of liturgical services. Bishop Julius Firzak, who commissioned the 1906 Prostopinije for liturgical chant, also asked Father Ioan Silvai to compile a collection of these non-liturgical songs, which was published in 1902 under the title Pizenik, meaning songbook or hymnal. In 361 pages, the Ujura Pizenik provided 181 hymns, some with as many as 30 or 40 verses, all without musical notation. But a much smaller number of melodies actually had to be learned, since many of the hymns were printed under a heading which indicated the melody to be used, taken from a different hymn. The hymns in the Pizenik were in various Rusin dialects of Slavonic, and the book also included prayers and devotions as well. Overall, it served as a complement to the Veliki Sbornik. The Sbornik provided the texts of hymns to be sung during the divine services, while the Pizenik contained non-liturgical hymns to be sung before and after services, during pilgrimages, and under similar circumstances. Some of these melodies were borrowed for use in singing the cherubic hymn. In most cases, the text of the cherubic hymn was divided into 3 sections, and each section was sung to the hymn melody as if it were a verse of a hymn. In Slavonic, this often required that sections of the text be repeated several times. One decision of the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission to reduce this sort of repetition in a liturgical text had a significant effect on the English settings of the cherubic hymns in the 2007 Divine Liturgies book. In 1970, Father Stefan Pop, the same Greek Catholic priest who had edited the new Irmologian for the Greek Catholic Church in Slovakia, published a small collection of hymns with music, many of which were similar to those in the Ujura Pizenik. The most popular of the spiritual songs were often included in prayer books for the laity and in later editions of the Sbornik. The 1978 Divine Liturgies book in the United States, the one in parallel English and Slavonic, contained an appendix with a selection of spiritual songs and Christmas carols in Rusin and in English translation. A certain amount of confusion was added by the editing of the Slavonic text, as Monsignor Levkulik adjusted some of the Rusin texts to be closer to proper Church Slavonic grammar. The Moodle page for this course has several links to online collections of spiritual songs. Only a small number of the hymns in the Ujura Pizenik and similar collections have been translated into English, and some of the existing English translations are quite remote from the Rusin original text. So we will continue to see new translations over time, and we can hope to see more. In addition, new hymns continue to be composed. Cantor John Kahanek wrote a text and melody for a hymn to St. Michael, and Professor J. Michael Thompson of the Byzantine Catholic Seminary composed a cycle of hymns set to familiar Carpathian and English hymn tunes for the Sundays of the liturgical year. These hymns were based on the readings and stichera for each Sunday, and filled a gap in the available cycle of paraliturgical hymnody. And that concludes our study of the Prostopinije singing tradition. We have followed the development of the Prostopinije chant, the development of cantor schools and the appearance of the cantor teacher as an important local figure, the rise of congregational singing out of the Veliki Sbornik, and the immigration of the chant to America and its use in English. We've also seen continuing attempts to standardize the chant, and a countervailing pressure to maintain older melodies or preserve local variations. The preservation and renewal of the Prostopinije chant tradition depends in large part on the continued training and the formation of church cantors, who through their often volunteer and unsung contribution contribute so much to the prayer of our church. In particular, the desire to restore a more complete cycle of services will involve either a great simplification of our church singing, or else a corresponding need for better and more thorough chant education, so that Vespers and Matins can be sung with the facility that cantors now possess with the Divine Liturgy. English is also not the only new language in which Prostopinije can be sung. There already exist parishes that have sung our Plainchant in Spanish and in Afrikaans. We are approaching the 150th anniversary of the publication of the Veliki Sbornik in 1866. It is possible that in 10 years we may reach a point at which cantors and faithful can once again sing from liturgical texts rather than from entirely notated chant books. This would certainly simplify the books needed for the various services, and might also allow the chant to more transparently convey the prayers and hymns being sung. This would provide a real test of one of the basic decisions of the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission in preparing the new chant promulgations in the 20th century, namely, their resolution to choose a consistent pattern for each chant melody in the Prostopinije tradition, and to use these patterns in providing settings of Prostopinije chant in English for congregational use. So the final question is this: is it possible for us to own our own chant tradition in such a way that a book like the Veliki Sbornik could again become a feature of our churches? And is this desirable?